Hamilton, do you see the title?
Yeah. Okay. Our first speaker will be Rolando Pineda, and he will be presenting the cinematic subconscious, the making of an artificial reality. And this will be about virtual reality therapy, which is a new form of exposure therapy, incorporating the new virtual reality technology in order to create a safe and controlled environment.
Thank you. Just a quick disclaimer. I think that is not my abstract, but the title is correct. So
Sorry, Rolando.
it's all good. It's all good. So I am going to share my screen here.
Oh man.
Perfect. Cool. So thank you for the presentation. Thanks for Billy for being my mentor and guiding me through this and giving me feedback. So I want to start talking about why I chose films. Films are super popular. On a daily basis, I hear my coworkers talking about films and movies. And as a matter of fact, most of us have the same patterns when we're watching a film. We shut down the lights, we get in a comfortable position, and we allow ourselves to immerse into into that reality that the film is presenting to us. And when a film is presenting that reality to us, we subconsciously allow it to influence our innermost thoughts and emotions. In fact, films are so popular that adults spend a total of 314 minutes a day watching video content. The film industry made a record $101 billion in 2019. That just kind of gives us an idea of how popular they are. And films are popular because they're powerful in telling a story. And they're powerful because filmmakers have figured out ways to tap into our cognition. And I want to talk about the way that filmmakers tap into our cognition. So I'm going to define what cognition is. I'll also talk about the cognitive mechanisms and the cinematic techniques that are involved in filmmaking. And ultimately, I'm going to also talk about some of the film and cognitive theories that explain why film is so powerful. So to begin, I want to talk about cognition. Cognition is the process of thinking and learning. It involves attention, perception, thinking, judging, memory, and language. Uh, Cognition is involved in us imagining things, and it also helps us represent objects and events. Cognition also helps us form this concept that we call the mind. Theories in embodied, embedded, inactive, extended, and effective cognitive science argue that the mind is made up of continuous interaction between us and our environments. So that interaction between us and our environment is influenced by that cognition. So the process of learning, the process of making sense of our environment, that's cognition. And our environment is everything that you physically see, everything that you interact with, everything that you sense, that you feel. But it also involves cultural artifacts and social trends like artwork and film or music. And when we're watching a film, cognition is involved because we're learning new information. We're trying to make sense of the characters, we're trying to make sense of the plot, we're trying to make sense of the context, and we're judging whether we like it or not. And filmmakers understand that. So in order to take advantage of our cognition processes during film, they developed this first technique that I will define as the cinematic point of view. The cinematic point of view refers to the way that they use the camera to present different points of view during a film. It's so powerful because they have the ability to manipulate our sense of time and space. It also matches our biological senses. So it is thought that film is so powerful because it mirrors the way that we see things in real life. But as film has become more and more popular, we also have adapted and we've come to accept this artificial point of view that a camera presents to us. So think about how the camera moves in a film. It can go through walls, it can go through doors, it can go forward in time or backwards in time. And as films became popular, we just kind of accept that as normal, as natural. And when we're watching it, our brains, they don't think, oh, that's not real. And it doesn't make us reject that point of view that the film is presenting to us. A great example of this biological point of view and artificial point of view is Alfred Hitchcock. So Hitchcock believes that we're all voyeurs. And oftentimes in his films, he will place the camera in hidden places to give that sense of being a voyeur. And also he will use the camera to kind of mimic the way that our heads move back and forth when we're seeing someone. So on this clip, for example, from the movie Psycho, you will see Marion, the character, she's wearing a bra. When this movie came out, this was pretty radical and pretty progressive with a sexual undertone. But most importantly, the camera here is playing two roles. The voyeur side, watching Marion change and doing her private things. And second, you will see how the camera moves back and forth following Marion across the room, kind of mimicking what our bodies would do. So again, the artificial point of view of being there and not being detected by the camera, and the natural point of view of kind of looking back and forth. Perfect. So Alfred Hitchcock was really good at mirroring that. And the other technique that filmmakers have used, oh, sorry. I'm gonna have to do this out here and just skip this. There we go. Perfect. And the other technique that filmmakers use is montage and editing. Montage is the sequence of shots that shows a condensed series of events. Montages are so powerful because they transmit to us a lot of information at once. And oftentimes they go unnoticed. And subconsciously, we accept that we can see the world through non-accessible perspectives. We also accept that we can follow multiple storylines at once. And we can see people or things from several perspectives. When they mix it with editing, oftentimes it goes unnoticed because what they'll do is that they'll time it with natural processes like blinking, or they'll time it um, with saccades. And if they do that correctly, a lot of the times it's going to go noticed. So here's an example. So short clip, but nothing major. So I don't know if you know this, but on this clip, this car here is actually a miniature version of the car. They didn't use a real size car. And as it comes across this wall right here, the car on the left is an actual real size vehicle, and the one on the right is just a miniature version. So they edited in and they used that biological process of looking from right to left and that break there in the middle to edit the image to go noticed from our brains. So pretty powerful stuff there. Then cool. So now I want to talk about some of the film and cognitive theories that explain why some of these cinematic techniques are so powerful. And one of the most important things in cognition and the theories that I'm going to talk about is the role of emotions. Emotions are critical because they allow us to judge things, to make decisions, and to also make sense of the thoughts that we're having. Now, cognitive scientists have defined a couple of principles that are essential for emotions, and that's that emotional reactions are often linked to an object, a person, or something. And the second principle is that emotional reactions, in order for us to experience an emotional reaction, certain criteria must be met. So if I'm going to feel fear, I need to be able to witness something that's going to make me fear, or I need to feel something that's going to make me fear. And Greg Smith, who's a professor of film, he says that emotional high points of a film must be seen in the context of the general mood of the film, and that moods are often generated less by narrative prominent features and more by non-person elements, of which music is given a particular attention. Now, we all know how powerful music is. We love it. We listen to it a lot of the times, and it seems that we can find a song for everything that we're feeling. But when it comes to film, sound comes in two ways, either diegetic or non-diegetic. Diegetic sound refers to that sound coming from the film itself, so things that the characters can hear. And non-diegetic sound comes from outside of the film, like the soundtrack or the voice of the narrator, if there's one, things that we can hear but the characters cannot hear. And filmmakers, when they successfully combine it, they can create powerful combinations that help us feel emotional reactions. So here's an example from Kill Bill by Quentin Tarantino. And in this clip, you'll see a combination of non-diegetic and diegetic sounds to make a very powerful scene that gives you a lot of tension. Perfect. So yeah, this was a combination of a montage and how sound can create moments of tension in movies. And then the next concept and theory I want to talk about is desire. Um, Cognitive scientists have defined two ways that desire manifests itself in film, and that's character desire and narrative desire. Character desire refers to you wanting something to happen for the character, and narrative desire refers to wanting something to happen in the narrative. Along with that, there's the concept of self-identification. And there's two ways that this manifests in a film as well. First is when we imagine ourselves as being the character and feeling what he feels, or seeing what he feels. And the second is empathetic. And this refers to not only imagining, but actually feeling what that character feels or does. And desire and self-identification ultimately combine and create this concept called the surrogate body in cinema. So the surrogate body in cinema is a recent theory that argues that when a filmmaker is creating a film, they're not only thinking about the film itself, but they're also thinking about the role of your body in watching that film. And they understand the biological processes and cognitive processes that are taking place in your body when you're watching a film. So they kind of plan around that. And the surrogate body is kind of the combination between your biological senses and the rules and the context of the film to help you overcome obstacles that you normally would have in real life. So they use the cinematic point of view in the surrogate body cinema. So think of movies that you watch. When we're watching them, we think of them as real. It allows us to overcome that 2D point of view, or it allows us to look at cartoons in an almost realistic way and feel things that we wouldn't feel. Montage and editing, it's used to help us get information, a lot of information at once. Also helps us follow multiple storylines, but it is also used so that it's undetectable by our brains and giving us that sense of realism also, and it doesn't trigger any warnings to our brain that, hey, this is not real. Desire and identification, this is very important in that surrogate body in cinema, because if there's no desire for a character or the narrative, or if we don't identify with that character, we're not going to be emotionally and bodily engaged with that character or that film. And lastly, emotions. So when we desire something for a character, or we identify with that character, there's going to be an emotional and biological reaction. So if you've watched Bambi, you know how sad that movie is. You saw Bambi losing his mom, and you probably felt sad. So you maybe desired for him to have a good outcome. You identified with him, with the sadness that he felt. And some of us even got to the point that we may have cried. So there was a biological reaction triggered there. So the surrogate body helps filmmakers overcome those limitations that we would have in our lives. And it is bound by biological rules, but it's also affected by the rules that the filmmaker will impose on that film. So how powerful a film is really depends on the filmmaker understanding these processes and these theories, and making films and helping us overcome those limitations within our minds. And it's important that we understand these things when we're watching a film, because our cognition is exposed. And going back to what cognition is the process of learning, of making sense of our reality, or imagining things. And when we're watching a film, we're allowing that filmmaker to influence our thinking, our learning. We're allowing that filmmaker to influence our imagination. So I propose that when we're watching a film, keep in mind how that filmmaker is trying to influence your thoughts, and be aware of it so that you can make better decisions after. And that's my presentation, and here are the sources that I used.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Rolando. Great presentation, very engaging as always. We now have about 5 minutes for Q&A, so you guys can go ahead and just unmute yourselves, ask your questions, or you can also put them in the chat.
How did you decide which films that you were going to use and get clips from?
Yeah, so I actually picked moments and films that are some of my favorite. So I love the movie Kill Bill, and I think that sequence is one of my favorites of all time. And the whistling is so catchy. Back to the Future, when I learned about that sequence of the mini vehicle and the real size vehicle, I thought that was crazy, because I didn't notice it at all. And then Bambi, because probably one of the saddest moments in film history, I think. So just gonna some of my favorites overall.
I got a question for you, Rolando.
Yes.
So really good job. I love the examples you used, and it's always cool as a mentor to see when, not that it's surprising, but it's always cool to see some of the feedback and how it kind of worked its way in there. So I appreciate you working hard even over the last few days to kind of just keep improving your presentation. But my question is, why do you think film, and you kind of touched on it, just like with the immersive nature of film. So why do you think film is different than other art forms in its ability to kind of connect with our mind in a more like kind of dynamic way? Like you think about other art forms, like, or even if you like separate them, like music and, like painting or photography, like what makes film unique, do you think?
Yeah. So interestingly enough, when I was doing research for this, I found that our brain is engaged in different ways when we're watching a film than when we're looking at different forms of art. So scientists did research on it, and they ran fMRIs and they ran EEGs on people that were watching a film, and they noticed that the neural activity is a lot more when you're watching a film, and it's because it goes unnoticed by your brain. So when you're watching when you're looking at a painting, for example, your brain has limitations because it knows it can't do certain things. If you're not good at painting, you're not likely to think, oh, this is real, because you're just not good, right? Your brain doesn't think it can do it. But with film is different because it creates that sense that that you can do that because you've done it before. It draws from the past on those experiences that you've had, and engages your emotions the way that no other form of art can do. And sound, for example, uses just one sense, right? Sound. But film gets a combination of biological, visual, and sound. And that's what makes the difference between film and other works of art.
Hey, Rolando. Why do you think 3D and 4D theatrical experiences haven't taken off?
So I think that we still, there's definitely the senses of the role of vision while watching a film is very important still. And like I argued, is that the ability for us to look at a film in a realistic way really depends on the filmmaker and how he uses those techniques to make it come to life. So I think we just haven't experienced a filmmaker really shining on that side of film industry for us to accept it as real. And I also think that there's economic factors that go into play. The technology is not widely available and not as affordable as well.
Where do you go from here? What's the next step in this research for you? Or are you done with this topic?
No, I actually am going to do a lot more research on this topic still because I love it. For me, I really want to understand how the mind works, and understanding the role of film in that is very important, which is why I took film classes. I took 2 of them so I could understand it more. My next step on this will be to kind of follow more of those scientific studies and dive deeper into the neural activity that's happening. Um, and that's kind of what my next process is. It's going to be on this research.
Awesome, thank you. Does anyone else have any more questions for Rolando before we move to our next presenter? Rolando, were you able to see Daniel's comment in the chat? It wasn't a question so much as just wanted to make sure you got to see it. And yeah, okay, if there's no more questions, Hamilton, I'll hand it back to you to introduce the next speaker, and then Rolando will run a Q&A after that presentation.
Okay, our next speaker, Glenna Trone, is presenting Girls, Gore, and Gender, analyzing the role of the final girl in horror films. A visual and textual analysis of the rise of female representation in the horror genre during the 1970s and 1980s.
Thank you, Rolando. Yeah, so like Rolando said, I will be analyzing the role of the trope of the final girl in horror films, specifically the slasher film genre, and how that reflects society's view of women at the time. Now, before I go into this, I do want to give a sort of trigger warning. While I'm not going to go into graphic detail, there will be mentions of violence and sexual assault. So if that's something that makes you uncomfortable, or you think it will make you have a bad time, just take a moment and think about that, and you can leave if you want to. I'll give you a few seconds. Okay, great. So I would like to argue, while it's super easy to look at these slasher films as gore and nasty, messy films that are vulgar, which I'm not going to say that they're not, they are. I do think that they do something kind of important at the time. I would say that horror films in the 1970s and 1980s that fulfill this final girl trope reflect society challenging this idea of gender containment in place. Containment was originally a geopolitical strategy put in place by the United States government to curb communism, but we did see it kind of sink into everyday culture and lifestyles in the idea of like, based on your gender, race, or religious, political beliefs, that you should fulfill your stereotype and essentially like be stuck in that. I'm focusing on the gender containment or gender stereotype that would have been put like in place from the 40s to the 60s, and now it's being challenged in the 70s and 80s with feminism and the rise of specifically this. So I'm going to be focusing on the film Texas Chainsaw Massacre, I Spit on Your Grave, and the Stephen King's novel, Carrie. There was also a film version of that. I got the term the final girl from author Carol J. Clover from her book Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film. She coined that term, the final girl, and she definitely sees the significance of her in horror film. While Carol J. Clover in her book, she focused more on the male viewer's relationship to the female role and how that was significant. I'm going to focus more on how the female role represents society's view on women. But she also saw that the slasher horror genre is more than just, as she put it, gore porn. There's a little bit more going on there, and a lot of horror films kind of paved the way for future films, sci-fi like Alien or something like that. So you're probably wondering, what's the final girl? She is a feminine role. She doesn't technically have to actually be a she. It usually is, but it could be a character that is seen as having stereotypically more feminine traits. Usually at the beginning of the film, they're the first person to know that something's awry. They're very perceptive. They are aware. They have a quote virgin quality. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually a virgin. They usually tend to have like an unavailability to them, whether it be like they're not romantically involved or that they have a partner and they're curbing like others' advances. To be the final girl, you got to be the last one standing at the end of the bloodbath. In this case, she suffers the longest, goes through the most trauma, but comes out on the end. And usually they are young and are what society would consider like stereotypical beauty standards. And yeah, so they go through this suffering. They usually watch their friends and families get brutally murdered, but they either come out and they either just survive the monster until they can get help, or they can kill the monster sometimes at the end. Yeah, sorry, my cat's meowing. So to start off, I'm going to look at Carrie, the novel. I did include some shots from the film for visual appeal. The interesting thing about Carrie is that not only was she a female character, but she was, as King put it, relatable to the male viewer, and also as Clover put it, even in Clover's interview with Stephen King, she recalled that he said, Carrie's revenge is something that any student who has ever had his gym shorts pulled down in phys ed or his glasses thumb rubbed in study hall could approve of. And it's very clear that King is using he, him pronouns to this female character. So if you haven't seen Carrie, it's a story about a young girl in high school. She's been bullied for years. And when she gets her first menstrual cycle, she develops these telekinetic abilities. Now, at first, she isn't aware of these abilities, but throughout the story, she starts to become more aware and eventually uses this telekinetic ability to exact revenge on her oppressors. There is one character that does feel sorry for Carrie, that is Sue Snell. And she, to try and be nice, asks her partner to take Carrie to prom, where some other kids put pig's blood above the prom king and queen area. And when they win prom king and queen, dumps blood on Carrie. And this kind of marks the bloodbath that is Carrie, where she moves from being a victim into a monster role. Now, this challenges gender containment in two ways. The first way is by making this feminine role, this heavily feminine role, relatable to male viewers, is challenging of gender containment, making the male identify with this female character. And then the second one is by putting the female character in the monster type role, which is typically a role reserved for masculine type monsters or individuals. Now, that also fulfills the final girl trope, because in the end, after Carrie burns down the entire city, Sue Snell is the last girl standing to face Carrie. And she sees her partner die. She sees her entire town go up in flames and faces this horrific traumatic experience. And also at the end, in the novel at least, I don't think this happens in the film, Sue Snell finds Carrie bloody in a parking lot and has this telekinetic intimacy that King's alludes to as a sort of rape, which also provides Carrie with another masculine trait of penetration, which also challenges this idea of gender containment. Carrie starts out as the victim and then becomes the monster, and then Sue Snell fulfills that final girl role and sort of faces her. But Carrie ends up dying on her own due to blood loss, and Sue Snell does not end up destroying the monster, but getting away. The next film I would like to talk about is the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And if you haven't seen this one, it's about our final girl in this film is Sally Hardesty. And she goes with her brother and a few friends to go on like a camping trip. They encounter an individual along their way that kind of foreshadows that something bad might happen. And then they end up in this family of cannibals. And they all get killed off one by one, except for, of course, Sally. And we can see Sally challenging gender containment by she repeatedly lives through this torture and watching her brother and friends get brutally murdered. She gets tortured herself. She gets away. She's very resourceful. And then she gets caught again, then she gets away until at the end, she does escape the monster and gets a ride away from this home of cannibals. I did put this one quote at the beginning just because it kind of focuses on the kind of categories of being a final girl. And the narrator at the beginning says, "The film which you're about to see is an account of a tragedy which befell a group of 5 youths, in particular, Sally Hardesty. It is all the more tragic in that they were young, but that had they lived very, very long lives, they could not have expected, nor would they have wished to see as much of the mad and macabre as they were to see that day. For them, an idyllic summer afternoon drive became a nightmare." And this kind of foreshadows that, you know, Sally might be the survivor. They are young, and like the final girl requirement, she is young and stereotypically beautiful. We also see some foreshadowing with the poster, who will survive and what will be left of them. This challenges the gender stereotype of women being incapable, because she's able to get away from these horrific cannibals that are trying to eat her, I guess. And at the time, you know, women, at least the previous years, were thought to need to be the homemakers, need to be gentle, soft, submissive. And in this case, Sally was not that. So this is kind of our first degree of the final girl by escaping the monster. And we'll move on now to the second degree, which is defeating the monster. So the next film that I analyzed was I Spit on Your Grave from 1978. I would not recommend that anyone watch this film. It is horrifying. I think it's disgusting, and I think it does cross a line. Well, that being said, it does do something that I think is very important. It has the female lead, the final girl, defeat her adversary and overcome the monster on her own terms. And something that is common throughout all of these films is that the male counterparts to these final girl roles are inadequate. They either fall short of saving them, or they arrive to save them and then they get murdered themselves or face bad outcomes. I Spit on Your Grave, if you haven't seen it, I would not recommend anyone watch this. They made several remakes, but they're all incredibly graphic. Our final girl is Jennifer Hill, and she's a fiction writer. She goes up to a house, a cabin in the woods. I think it belongs to her friend, to kind of like get inspiration for writing. As she enters into the small town that is near the cabin, she fulfills that virgin quality by curbing the advances of several men that were flirting with her, catcalling her. Later, those men arrive at the cabin and assault and rape her, and of course are the monsters. Then the rest of the film is spent while Jennifer exacts revenge by killing all of them. So not only does she survive, she kills the monsters, making her like the second level of the final girl, which challenges this idea of gender containment by placing her in the role of a judge, executioner, and kind of her own hero. She ends up fulfilling her own act of judgment, and is very capable in exacting revenge on these male characters, which again challenges this idea of women being incapable, of women being weak, not what's the word? Not like as well thought out in execution of things as men were thought to be at the time. So it's very interesting. And while all of the films I mentioned before are very bloody and they do show lots of violence towards these women, and while I'm not sure even if the directors meant to do this on purpose, these characters are somewhat empowering to the female identity because they make it through all of this horror. Now, this trope became so popularized that a modern satire was developed in 2011 to kind of poke fun at this ritualistic expectation in the slasher horror genre. The Cabin in the Woods was marketed as just any other sort of horror film. It did not give any clues or ideas to what you would actually get when you went to the movie theater, which was very interesting. And it challenged that expectation that viewers typically have when they go to a slasher horror film. If you haven't seen The Cabin in the Woods, it is about a group of friends that go to a cabin in the woods, and they ritualistically are being sacrificed by this sort of secret society that keeps these old gods at bay through this sacrifice. And the virgin character, the final girl, is supposed to be the only one that could survive this trauma. So it's kind of like poking fun at this idea that the reason that all of these stories happen is because there's a secret society trying to keep these evil giant gods underground. This one has a little bit of a twist on it. It marks the failing, what happens when you fail to fulfill that idea. And instead of just the one final girl of Dana on the left here, Marty also survived. And while usually the final girl is the one that sees the problems and the danger before Marty in this case was, it gives that classic final girl trope a twist and sort of confirms that this was such a popular idea that they made a satire about it. So overall, I love horror films, and doing this project was really enjoyable for me, but I have not considered myself a slasher horror fan, and this even challenged like my idea of how I see the slasher horror genre. I personally used to think of it as just unclassy gore porn, like Clover put it. But after doing this project, I find that, and I would hope you to consider that the final girl is an empowering character that began challenging this idea of gender stereotypes and gender containment that was in place before the 1970s and 80s, and marked kind of the turn of the female role in film. And it was heavily significant to start putting these women in these hero type or survivor type characters, because it hadn't really previously been done a whole lot before. And I hope the next time you see a horror film, specifically a slasher one, you try to see if you can pick out who the final girl is. Remember, it doesn't necessarily have to actually be a girl, but someone who has those stereotypical feminine qualities, or someone who just might appear to not be capable, but is very perceptive and notices the danger at the beginning and has that kind of like, again, virgin, not virgin like quality. But yeah, so this was a fun project for me to do. Here's my works cited. We acknowledge The Cabin in the Woods, Carol J. Clover's Men, Women, and Chainsaws, I Spit on Your Grave, Stephen King's Carrie, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. There's many more slasher horror films that you could look at and analyze to identify this final girl trope. And thank you for listening. I really appreciate it, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.
Thank you, Glenna. That was a great presentation. I really enjoyed it. So we'll have 5 minutes of Q&A as well. So if anyone has questions for Glenna.
I'll go ahead and jump in. I know the answer to a lot of questions because, and I appreciated sort of the echoes and the things that will emerge later in the project, like that rural-urban split and some of the other things we had talked about in terms of the economics and the resourcefulness. And so thank you for that great presentation. One thing I was just wondering on in terms of expanding on sort of Cabin in the Woods, because Cabin in the Woods is such an interesting but kind of niche example to some degree. And I just wonder then more broadly about this idea of containment within modern horror, and if you think there are still ideas of containment within modern horror film, or are we evolving past the role of the final girl? Is that role shifting more recently? Because Cabin in the Woods sort of suggests that, but maybe even more broadly, what do you think is going on in more modern horror film?
Yeah, I definitely think that Cabin in the Woods is a kind of special exception where it's people that probably loved horror acknowledge that trope, and we're sort of kind of even challenging the containment of the challenging of containment, if that makes sense. I still like to kind of, I love horror, so I like to keep up with any of the new horror films that come out. I do see a sort of deviation from the final girl, where I see it, sometimes there's more than one individual that does make it out alive from the carnage, or nobody does. However, I do also still see the final girl be present quite often in horror film. I just watched this one with my partner that came out a couple years ago, where they went to Mexico, and this plant essentially was eating everyone in this temple that they shouldn't have gone in, of course. And I was able to pick out who the final girl was, and she did make it out alive, the only one. So I do think that there is going to be some deviation of that. But I do think it's still a classic trope that is ever present. I would love to see what is going to happen next in horror, what kind of roles are going to be represented now, and what kind of containment will be challenged now. Because something that also Clover mentioned was that a lot of that B-rated slasher horror genre did kind of pave the way for more what is it, like societally accepted films like Alien or Terminator and stuff like that. So I'm interested in seeing what happens next. So I don't know.
Also, and Glenna, we also have a question for you from Billy. He asked in the chat. He said, "Thank you, Glenna. Excellent work. Why do you think horror is a genre that breaks gender norms rather than gangsters or musicals, for example?"
Do you mean like gangster films, Billy? Or
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, okay. I think horror is a place where there weren't as many, you're not playing to the common society as much. So there's a lot more room to kind of do something that is taboo. And while later on, I do think that there were some feminine empowered roles that came forth in maybe later gangster movies and later musicals, at this time, there were still quite a few of that idea of like the women needed to be saved, or the women was more like an eye candy, or what is it, like a martyr character. But in the horror film, there's more room to kind of do whatever you want, because you're not trying to please as many viewers. You're trying to please a very niche group of people. And that gives them some creative freedom and some ideas of like what they can do. Like, I spit on your grave. I don't think anyone in the normal society would enjoy that. And if you do, if that movie does not make you uncomfortable, I am a little concerned maybe with the way you're thinking. But it also is like, it's important to access that taboo and kind of challenge that idea of like, what is acceptable? What is something that you would or would not want to see? So that's kind of what I think about that. I guess to summarize that is, I guess horror is kind of a taboo genre, and it has that leeway to sort of break that idea of what is and isn't acceptable at the time of its creation. Yes, Billy. Also, Jordan Peele's horror films confront race in a very dynamic way. I love their films. I think that they're very interesting and quite. It's such a great time to call out uncomfy subjects, so to speak.
Awesome. Thank you, Glenna. Does anyone else have questions for Glenna?
Hey, Glenna. From the inception of the 70s and 80s Final Girl films, did you notice like an increase in women taking part in the production of the films, especially as like writers or directors?
I did notice that there were a couple of films after that where more women were taking part in the maybe not the direction, but like the writing and stuff like that. I do know that who was it? One of the wives or the partners of the guy that directed I Spit on Your Grave did kind of take part of a film a little bit later on. And it is kind of interesting to see also just the women that play these roles, I think is very interesting. They do take charge in how they present their role and how they are performing, which I think was kind of like a foot in the door to later more women being a part of making of the horror films.
Awesome. And I think we have a question in the chat as well from Angela. She said, great presentation, Glenna. 2 questions. Why do you think remakes are not as successful when it comes to these classic slashers? And do you see any movements to more inclusiveness like LGBTQA?
That's an excellent question. Remakes are interesting because well, at least an argument that Clover makes is that people enjoy the remakes because they already know what's going to happen. And a part of that enjoyment of the horror film is kind of knowing what is going to occur. Like it's like the same film, but it's just different people. However, I think that they fall short a lot because it's the same film, but it's different people. It's nothing new. And I do think people prefer some more like a new look on representation. I do see in some more modern movies inclusiveness of LGBTQA in a positive light. I have seen previously where LGBTQA plus communities were seen in a negative light in some horror films, but I'm very excited to see that representation coming out more in current horror and hopefully future horror films representation.
Awesome. Thanks, Glenna. So now Hamilton will introduce our next speaker.
Our final speaker is Austin Quant. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. And his project will be on political cinema. It will be about he will use the 1962 film, The Manchurian Candidate, the 1960 film Psycho, along with other films. And this presentation will prove that all cinema is inherently political.
Withholding consent, the Supreme Court during the Progressive Era by Austin Quant.
This is
mentor,
the wrong
Professor Lisa.
presentation, I think. Yeah.
Austin,
Yeah, that's what's on there.
Austin, what, sorry guys, let me see if I can find it. What day did you send it to me? That must.
I think I sent it to you on the 13th, but I can, or I think it was the 12th actually, and then, yeah, the 12th.
Okay, and was it, you think to the honors email address or to my personal one?
I believe to the honors one. I'm checking right now too.
Okay, yeah, I'm not seeing anything from you in here. Anything else? Sorry, everyone. Thank you for bearing with us.
Yeah, I sent it to the honors one on the 12th.
Okay. on the 12th. Let me find it really quick and then I can share it on my screen. Interesting. Sorry, everybody. All right.
Political cinema. In the following presentation, I will use the 1962 film The Manchurian Candidate and the 1960 film Psycho, along with other films, to prove that all cinema is inherently political. Film is a medium of art that allows the director to express certain themes and messages that the audience can relate to. There are many different genres of film, including comedy, science fiction, western, and much more. However, political cinema is the most broad and universal genre. Political cinema includes any film that contains a social or political message, or on the contrary, has an absence of any social or political message. According to the article, The Prospects for Political Cinema Today, author Gianni Amilo writes that political cinema can seek to raise social and political questions or challenge prevailing belief systems. Using this definition, political cinema can include, but is not limited to, themes that challenge current social and political systems, raising and bringing awareness to political and social conflicts, and to the contrary, avoiding using any political or social message. This allows political cinema to connect with a wide variety of themes and engage with a diverse and large audience. The Manchurian Candidate, directed by John Frankenheimer, was a movie made in 1962. The plot centers on Raymond Shaw, a U.S. Army sergeant during the Korean War who is captured and brainwashed by international communists. Once Shaw returns to the U.S., his mother, who is working with the foreign power, reveals to Shaw that he must assassinate the presidential nominee, so Shaw's stepdad, who is the vice presidential nominee, will become the presidential nominee, and therefore his mother and the foreign power will take over American society. In the end, Shaw kills his mother, stepdad, and himself in an attempt to stop the plan from occurring. One of the first scenes during The Manchurian Candidate occurs within a secret government facility. Shaw and his team of soldiers appear to be brainwashed and are unaware that they are being held captive by a foreign power. They believe that they're at a hotel in New Jersey which is hosting a women's gardening club event while they wait out a storm. Shaw and the other soldiers appear to be unable to focus, and they look uninterested in the events going on around them, which helps enforce the idea that they are brainwashed. From the soldiers' perspective, they see and hear the women talk about the gardening at the hotel. However, in reality, the scene shows that they are sitting in the foreign government facility surrounded by communists who are discussing the technique of brainwashing and how it can be used to effectively take over American society. The film was produced in 1962 during the height of the Cold War, in which there is a widespread fear of communism in society. In the article, American Science Fiction Film, A Bird's Eye View, author Pichu Ayamondi describes this fear of communism among society when he writes, "There is a popular fear of communism as a dehumanizing political system bent on destroying individual subjectivity, committed to world conquest, and using new forms of invasive and invisible domination like brainwashing. These films disguised Cold War nightmares about being taken over by powerful, inhumanly cold and rational others who would radically flatten out human emotion and transfer consciousness into a collectivity. This illustrates how during the Cold War, there is a widespread fear of communism in society, which was highlighted in this film. The scene showed the audience how communism could secretly slip into American society, like through an American soldier similar to Shaw. This scene displays a political theme because it helps highlight how political films express the social and political fears or desires of society. In this case, the scene shows extreme fear and paranoia of communism across American society during the mid-20th century. The author used cinematic language to help portray this fear and paranoia. The director used high-key lighting when the scene portrayed the soldiers at the hotel and the women's gardening club. However, low-key lighting was used when the scene showed the soldiers in the presence of the communists. This likely helped create a contrast between the more light and positive Women's Gardening Club event, which was just a lie to cover up the more dark and scary communist government. In addition, the director used close-up camera shots of the soldiers so that the audience could clearly see how incoherent and brainwashed the soldiers were. This effective use of brainwashing played to the social fear within the audience since it dramatically showed how communism could secretly take over American society. This scene was political because it displayed and played off of the confusion and the suppressed fears of many Americans as they were terrified of communism control and takeover during the Cold War. The next scene takes place when it is revealed that Shaw's mother is working with the communists to take over American society. In this scene, Shaw's mother details the plan that Shaw must follow in order to assassinate the presidential nominee at a political convention. This way, Shaw's stepdad, who is the vice presidential nominee, will become the presidential nominee and win the presidential election. Then Shaw's mother and the communists will have full access to the American government and furthermore American society. In the article Introduction Marking Political Cinema, author Iwa Mazierska describes an important factor of political cinema when she writes, "The ideal of political cinema is to affect external reality and especially the relationship between an individual and a community. This depicts how the director of the Manchurian Candidate is trying to represent how American society, which is the external reality, is having many suppressed and hidden fears regarding a foreign power taking over society. It shows the individual suspicions some people had with members of their own community at the time, as the mother seemed like a normal person before it was revealed she was working with the foreign government. The open portrayal of suppressed fears is political because the director is depicting how society had somewhat irrational and hidden fears regarding the spread of communism. The director helped portray this idea that there is a dark reality and turn of events through the use of low-key lighting in the scene. This lighting helped instill a mood of fear and paranoia in the audience. Furthermore, the dialect in the scene is very powerful as Shaw's mother gives a detailed and complex plan on how she will take over the government. This aided in the idea of suppressed fears, as the audience was likely afraid that a similar plan would occur in real life. This scene portrayed a dark and dramatic reality which expressed the political fears of the audience at the time. Furthermore, another scene from The Manchurian Candidate that shows that every film includes political in cinema is the scene at the political convention. In this scene, Shaw is in a stadium at a political convention above the crowd. The presidential nominee is giving a speech and Shaw appears to be getting ready to shoot him. His friend Marco tries to stop Shaw from shooting him, but he is too far away. However, Shaw decides to kill his stepdad, who is the vice presidential nominee, his mother, and himself. This marks the end of the foreign power who brainwashed Shaw trying to overtake American politics and society. In the article Melodrama and Tragedy in The Manchurian Candidate, author Joy McEntee describes how Frankenheimer painted Shaw as a conflicted character when she explains, Frankenheimer, however, certainly thought he was making a drama about a character divided from himself. Here is an individual, he said, trying to fight the inner conflicts which tormented him. This highlights how political films often show conflicts and differences of thought between character, society, and in this case, within the character, in order to show that politics and social questions can often be challenging to solve as there are many different perspectives. In this case, Shaw is conflicted about who to help, his mother who has helped brainwash him, or his country that he wants to serve. This scene represents how political films sometimes attempt to show societal expectation versus realities. In this case, the audience expected Shaw to kill the presidential nominee and for the foreign power to succeed. However, the reality of what occurred was different, with Shaw stopping the foreign power takeover. This reality was political, as it showed how the foreign power did not succeed and was stopped, which represented the idea that perhaps fears of communism were over-exaggerated and that societal fear was contributing to this issue. In addition, the reality that Shaw killed his mother and stepdad, who were both Americans, to stop the foreign power initiated the question, who in reality are the bad guys? This assassination scene often used bird-eye view camera angles, which showed the political convention from above from Shaw's perspective. This likely helped enforce the idea that Shaw had complete control to kill someone in the crowd at that moment. It made him seem more powerful than any of the audience members, which also helped portray the idea that a foreign nation had control over the crowd, as Shaw was brainwashed by them. This helped create a sense of suspense for the audience, as there was not much hope left for a different reality. In addition, the scene only uses diegetic sound, sounds that the characters can hear, in order to help illustrate a theme of realism. This effectively heightened the stakes for the film audience members because they saw this plot could be played out in real life and the possible consequences that could occur. the political expectation and reality in society can often be very different depending on different perspectives. While The Manchurian Candidate may be an overtly political film, whereas the 1960 film Psycho, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, is not, Psycho still contains several political messages. The film begins with focusing on Marianne Crane, a young secretary who runs away after stealing money from her work to Bates Motel. While at the motel, she is murdered by Norman Bates, the motel owner. Throughout the film, Marianne's sister, boyfriend, and a private detective try to solve the case, but slowly uncover that Bates has a dark past and is the culprit in the crime. Towards the end of the film, as Norman Bates is being taken into custody for his crime, a psychiatrist who evaluated Bates revealed that he likely suffers from alternate personality disorder. Bates had two personalities, his mother personality and himself. He killed Marianne and his other victims as his mother personality, who was jealous. This film was produced in 1960, which was a time in which society did not commonly and openly discuss mental health issues. In the article Criminal Madness, Cultural Iconography and Insanity, author Russell Covey describes how mental illness was portrayed differently in Hitchcock's films when he writes, "The monster movies, however, tended to heavily emphasize on the monster's manifest degeneracy, and mental illness was almost exclusively represented through physiognomy. That is, filmmakers identified morally depraved characters by virtue of visible physical features. In contrast, Hitchcock's characters were outwardly normal in appearance. Viewers learned of Hitchcock's character's madness through the first-hand experience." This illustrates how many films produced during this time period avoided talking about mental illness within society by either not discussing mental illness or using monster-like figures without human features to portray mental illness. However, in the film Psycho, Norman Bates portrayed an actual human who had a mental illness. Furthermore, the mental illness was named and discussed upon towards the end of the film. By bringing up issues with mental illness, Hitchcock effectively made a political statement. Other films and society as a whole valued the importance of having the ideal American family during this time, and avoided talking about real issues occurring within society like mental illness. The director helped portray this idea of mental illness through the acting and dialect of Norman Bates. In this scene, Bates is in a jail cell and has an eerie and creepy facial expressions on his face. Furthermore, he has a dialogue in his mind of what his mother's personality is thinking. Both of these aspects help further the idea that Bates has a dueling and dark personality. Psycho is a political film because it discussed this hidden issue of mental illness at a time when society was hiding it. One of the most famous scenes from Psycho is the shower scene. In the scene, Marianne is taking a shower in her motel room when Bates comes into the room and stabs Marianne to her death. In the article Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho and the cinematic novels of Don DeLillo and Manuel Munoz, author David Banish describes how author Manuel Munoz wrote how Psycho changed American culture when he writes, "In essence, Munoz begins by confirming our fantasy of Psycho as the most horrifying eruption of violence in cinema, the point where shocking violence enters mainstream American culture. This highlights how Psycho is very different from other films produced during this time period, because Psycho showed a murder scene within the film. Since most films during this time were trying to depict the perfect American life, most films did not highlight the issue of violence, even though it was still occurring within society. This decision to include a scene of violence within Psycho makes a political statement. This scene helps portray this theme of violence through the diegetic and non-diegetic sounds. The diegetic sounds, which include Marianne screaming, the shower water running, and the knife slicing through the air, all help build a sense of realism in everyday life, which helps show the audience how violence could occur within a normal situation. The non-diegetic sounds include the musical underscore, which is a dramatic song with an eerie and suspenseful tone, which helps build a tone of fear as the murder occurs. This clear use of violence in Psycho is a political statement. Similar to The Manchurian Candidate and Psycho, The Shawshank Redemption, The 400 Blows, and Precious Knowledge are all political films. According to the article, The Prospects for Political Cinema Today, author Gianni Amilo interviews Robert Guedehan, who describes how all films are political when he states, "Cinema, whether the filmmaker professes it or denies it, a point of view on the way in which humans live. In that sense, it is always political." This illustrates how every film has to be political because the director can specifically choose what themes or social messages are present or perhaps absent in their film. For instance, in the 1994 film Shawshank Redemption, the film does not occur on a political The film does not focus on a political question or theme. However, this film is still political because there are several scenes depicting the struggles that prisoners face once they are released from jail. It shows how prisoners struggle to return to society as they are not given the proper resources or training. This illustrates a social and political issue with prisons within society. In the 1959 film The 400 Blows, the film once again does not have a central political theme. However, this film is still considered a part of political cinema because throughout the film, the child tries to challenge the social order of society by running away from his parents and not listening to adults because he wants to live a life of freedom. Finally, this idea of all films being considered political extends to the documentary films as well. For instance, in the documentary Precious Knowledge, which was made in 2011, the documentary highlights the conflict between the state of Arizona and the Mexican American Studies program of a high school. This film is political because it shows the struggles that the students and teachers have to go through in order to maintain a Mexican American study program at their school, which allows students to feel more connected to the history they are learning. This film shows the political and social fears of the students and teachers as their academic program is being taken away from them, and it also highlights the political and social challenges facing students of color. Film is political because everyone has a different perspective and thought. Films are very diverse and they contain different plots and settings and themes. However, all films are inherently political. The Manchurian Candidate has many different aspects of political cinema within it, some of which are often used by different films. However, even though Psycho is not overtly political, it is still a part of political cinema because of the social and political messages present within the film during a time in which people avoided them. The director's decisions about what scenes to include, where the movie is filmed, and what themes are present, and which themes are absent, all come together to create a political film. Political cinema is a universal genre. Thank you for listening.
Perfect. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Austin, for the presentation. So we'll move to the Q&A. Does anyone have questions for Austin?
I have a question. So when you're saying that a lot of these like all movies are political, I'm wondering, how do you feel about the idea that all movies are political, like personally, and how do you think that affects, and what do you also consider to be a political topic, and how do you think it affects us as a society when those topics are politicized, I think is what you would say.
Yeah, so personally, I also agree that all films are political. I think that kind of one of the last slides I had was a quote that was something along the lines of every film has to be political because every film contains a director which directs the film, but they include their own perspectives on what scenes to include, what messages are present. So I think in that sense, I agree with that all films have to be political. And I think that it can affect society a lot. I think starting with sort of Psycho, that was sort of the beginning that people just started to see mental illness and violence being portrayed in films. And obviously, it just was the very, very beginning of those things starting to occur within films, and it was the very beginning of the discussion of mental illness and violence within society. And obviously there is a lot that happened in between Psycho and what happened today, but I think we can sort of see these topics, social topics and political topics that are talked about in within society. They sort of have an origin within the films that present them.
Perfect. Does anyone else have a question for Austin?
I see one in the chat for him. Billy says, well done. You mentioned that Hitchcock's willingness to confront mental illness is a big step forward. Will you talk about the other side of this? By showing mental illness resulting in the creation of a serial murderer, what are some of the drawbacks of this?
So yeah, this was a big issue since, as I was talking about in that slide, other filmmakers at the time were just portraying mental illness through non-human-like figures, monsters, but by portraying mental illness solely through somebody who murders people, it sort of stayed along that line of portraying mental illness as being like a monster's figure. Just this time, it was a human being, not a monster. But I definitely think that that was a really negative way to portray mental illness. And even though it was through a human, it was still really negative since it brings a negative connotation to mental illness.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question?
Hi, Austin. Great job. It was really cool to see how this whole topic evolved from the inception to now. And I thought you did a great job discussing cinema in the realm of being political. I wanted to touch on one of the things we talked about before about nostalgia. So we talked about that a lot when we talked about cinema and political cinema. Can you maybe speak to that a little bit, how nostalgia plays a role in these films and the audience expectation of that?
Yeah, so we watched several films in your class, but to kind of go along with Psycho in particular, I think, and the Manchurian Candidate, I think that the audience sort of wanted to go back to a time where life was maybe more simple, and I think the Psycho, other films in the 1960s, regardless of Psycho, they tried to portray the perfect life as having a family and living in the suburbs and not really discussing any real issues which were occurring in society at the time, such as mental illness. So Psycho they sort of helped break that uh, that cycle of movie filmmakers not really discussing, I guess, real issues within society, since mental illness was occurring in society in the early 1960s. It just wasn't talked about or shown in films because it was considered a taboo subject. So I think that was the first time that it was mental illness or violence was really discussed. So I think that sort of goes along with the fact that people in the early 1960s, or society as a whole, was afraid to touch these subjects because it was seen as taboo and it could ruin your reputation.
Thank you. Perfect. And then does anyone else have more questions for Austin? Cool. So I think we have about 5 minutes of break till we have the next set of presentations, right, Elizabeth?
Our first presenter is Josie Burris, and her project's on social media, a platform with ill consequences. And it will discuss the cause of where and how mental health illness starts to have an effect on young adolescents and adults through the use of social media.
All right, thank you, Hamilton. Josie, you can go ahead and share your presentation.
You're muted.
All right, there. Okay, so hello everyone. As Hamilton said, my name is Josie Burris, and today I'll be discussing the causes of where and how mental illnesses starts to have an effect on young adolescents and adults through their use of social media. More specifically, we'll be taking a look at where social media began to have a significant presence in the everyday life of young adolescents and adults, and more specifically, we will examine why there's been an enormous increase in mental illnesses within the past 10 years. Now, because this topic can be so extensively discussed, I want to mention that this evaluation is more of a broad overview. Each topic explained throughout the presentation can and does go into deeper context with more statistics to age groups and genders, but because the involving research is so new, it's constantly changing. And I also want to mention, I'm not here to discuss if social media use affects girls more than boys. I want to provide an overview of how social media can affect everyone, the mental health of everyone, regardless of their gender. Okay, so here's an overview. We'll be taking a look at where social media began, how and why things changed, and then we'll be taking a look at the influences, the cause, and how to avoid. So there are a couple of reasons why I feel it's important to discuss this topic. Firstly, it will help to combat the mental health stigma. Discussing mental health will help us understand just how common mental illness is and will provide us with opportunities to correct misconceptions. Secondly, this topic is very relevant in today's society and ultimately can have an effect on everyone, even if they don't use social media themselves. In addition, this research project also hopes to make people more socially aware and attuned to the effects social media can have on the psyche of young teens and adults that can ultimately be detrimental. Lastly, talking about social media or talking about the health issues associated with social media can encourage us to seek help and talk about how we're feeling with others. Discussing mental health with others can overall help us to encourage our mental well-being on a regular basis, and more importantly, in the wake of discussing mental health issues associated with social media, there are big hopes to lower the increasing rates of attempted suicide. I mention this because a study released by Centers of Disease Control and Prevention found that the rate of suicide among ages 10 to 24 has increased 57.4% between the years 2007 to 2018. And those years also correlate with the increase seen in smartphone usage and social media use. All right, so let's take a look at where it all started. There I have the definition of social media. So in 1997, we see our first social media platform known as 6 Degrees, which was based on a social network of existing connections between members of high school and college graduating classes, as well as workspaces. I personally didn't really know of this platform before researching. I can understand that what I've read, that it was short-lived for a time. LinkedIn in 2002 was founded, which focused on professional networking and career development. In 2003, we see MySpace, and then in 2004, Facebook, which is really popular. And it still is really popular. And then in 2006, we see Twitter was founded, and this can kind of conclude the early 2000 social media platforms. So in 2010, the world was taken by storm with the new foundation of a type of social media called Instagram. Instagram, in contrast to other early social media platforms, as previously discussed, was different from the start in a myriad of ways. Instagram, unlike Facebook, MySpace, Twitter, and LinkedIn, was introduced as an app on smartphones rather than a website through a computer. This was the same case for Snapchat. In addition, the wake of the smartphone revolution brought instant accessible communication and information. Most importantly, it brought an endless of access of entertainment for young adolescents and adults in the form of apps like Instagram and Snapchat. From here, the world starts to see a drastic increase in mental health issues mental health issues regarding young adolescents and adults. And now we'll see why. The main reason why there's been such an increase in the mental health issues in regards to social media within the past 10 years is simply due to the rising smartphone usage that really took off in 2010. The increase in smartphones has also boosted the use of popular social media platforms, but unfortunately, that's not the only thing increasing. The research conducted and presented by the American Psychological Association, the North Carolina Medical Journal, and the Canadian Medical Association Journal, which also presents like US statistics as well as Canadian, has found the following statistics and claims that will come. So for example, the increase of smartphone usage was up to an 81% increase in 2019 compared to a 35% increase seen in 2011. Furthermore, in the US, proportion of young people between the ages of 13 and 17 years of age who have a smartphone has reached 89%, more than doubling over a 6-year period. Moreover, 70% of teenagers use social media multiple times per day, which is a big increase from a third of teens seen using social media in 2012. Social media undoubtedly offers huge benefits for society by providing access and connection to people, services, information, and opportunities that previously wouldn't have been possible. However, evidence is growing, particularly in adolescent mental health, of an association between greater social media use and higher depressive and anxiety rates. In addition, around 86% of 18 to 29-year-olds use multiple social media platforms. And what's even more concerning is how many teenagers use multiple social media platforms, ranging from about 2 to 7. Since the release of smartphones, mental health concerns have increased drastically. The rate of adolescents reporting symptoms of major depression in a given year increased by 52% from 2005 to 2017, and from 2009 to 2017, it grew by 63% in adults ages 18 to 25. Experiencing psychological distress in a given month grew 71% in young adults from 2008 to 2017, and even worse, the rate of suicidal thoughts in young adults increased 47% during those years. All right, so we moved on to the cause of, or some of the causes. Like I said in the beginning, this is like a brief overview of how both boys and girls can feel effects from social media. The quotes that I've placed under each section is quotes that were provided to Pew Research from various boys and girls. So you can go ahead and kind of read those yourself. So there are a couple of reasons why young adolescents and adults find themselves struggling with mental illness while using social media. The first cause can be pinpointed to social comparison. Social comparison can go in one or two directions. Either people can have a tendency to make a downward social comparison with those who are worse off or less skilled than them, which can raise self-esteem, or people find themselves making an upward social comparison, which can reduce self-esteem, and most of the time this is the case. Young adolescents and adults find themselves comparing their lives with someone they follow on social media, whether they know the person or not. When people start engaging in social comparison, they are ultimately left with increased anxiety and depression symptoms, and in some cases, overwhelming negative body images. Secondly, another cause behind why young adolescents and adults find themselves caught in the midst of mental health issues such issues as anxiety, depression can be traced back to FOMO, which stands for the fear of missing out. This implies that users of social media fear they are missing out on certain things and that others are having more fun or living a better life than them. And this way of thinking can impact self-esteem, trigger anxiety, and feel greater social media use, which can lead to even more increased feelings of depression. The fear of missing out also enables young adolescents and adults to pick up their phone every couple of minutes to check for updates or compulsively to respond to every notification that comes up. For example, users may feel compelled to check their social media while driving, or rather than getting sleep at night, they stay up late, just scrolling through social media, seeing what everyone's up to. And most importantly, young adolescents and adults find themselves prioritizing social media interaction over real world relationships, which leads us into our third cause, isolation. Studies have found that among many other reasons, young adolescents and adults may become more isolated while using social media, which will also lead to increased feelings of loneliness and depression. For example, young adolescents and adults when they are out in a social atmosphere, they may feel more anxious, awkward, or lonely. They'll turn to their phones and log on to social media. This, of course, leads them to interacting with social media, which only denies them face-to-face interaction that can ultimately help actually ease anxiety. Excessiveness. Excessive social media use can create a negative self-perpetuating cycle for young adolescents and adults. For example, when users of social media are feeling lonely, they may use social media as a way to relieve boredom or feel as if they are connecting with others. But more than often, this leads to increased feelings of FOMO and feelings of inadequacy, dissatisfaction, and isolation rather than relieving boredom. In turn, these feelings negatively affect the mood of young adolescents and adults and will even worsen symptoms of depression, anxiety, and stress. These worsening symptoms then will cause young adolescents and adults to use social media even more, and the downward self-perpetuating spiral continues and becomes almost impossible to break. Lastly, one of the biggest cause of increased feelings of depression and anxiety can be traced directly back to cyberbullying, which is one of the biggest problems we face in today's society. Here are some statistical charts that show how social media can affect young adolescents and adults. So, Pew Research found that 60% of teenagers who have experienced cyberbullying in an online atmosphere, and moreover, 70% have reported someone spreading false rumors about them, and 90% of teens connect to the internet, while 85% of them mostly use social media. So in the chart, we can see that Instagram is the leading platform where people experience cyberbullying. And in the second chart below it, we can see that the main reason is because of their appearance, which is really sad. So let's move on to how to avoid. So in the wake of increased feelings of depression and anxiety centered around social media use, there are a couple of cautionary steps that can be taken in hopes of avoiding feelings of increased anxiety, depression, poor sleep habits, low self-esteem, and negative body image concerns. So first and foremost, limiting social media use is undoubtedly the best way to improve mental health. For example, a research conducted by the Journal of Social and Clinical Psychology found that using social media platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, and Snapchat for only 10 minutes a day for 3 weeks will lead to lower levels of loneliness and depression. The study also found that even reducing social media use to 30 minutes a day will also decrease feelings of anxiety, depression, loneliness, sleep problems, and the fear of missing out. Another solution to reduce the mental issues associated with social media use is to turn off social media notifications. What I have personally done, and it really helps because then you're not constantly getting all of those notifications, because it can be really hard to resist the temptation of social media when the constant like ringing and buzzing of our phone goes off every minute or so. Social media sends countless notifications for various things, either when someone we follow likes a picture or someone sends us a message. So there can just be a lot of notification coming up all the time. So turning off notifications can help us to regain control of our time and focus. Turning off our phone, so the source, can also really help at certain times of the day, like while we're driving or in a meeting or at the gym, having dinner, spending time with friends, or even like using the restroom can give our minds the mental break we need from social media. Also, you don't have to turn off your phone, but if you put it on airplane mode, you'll be turned off to the media. So now we get to our last and most effective way to combat mental health problems caused by social media, which is simply to have like a detox period. Deleting social media apps from our phone for even a week can help to reduce mental health issues significantly. But it's important to understand that these suggestions are not permanent fixes. In the end, if someone wishes to expel all of the negative psychological effects of social media, they may consider not having social media platforms at all. But in the wake of the 21st century and how we live today, everyone is on social media and it's become a way that we kind of do business. So I think the best way for us is to talk about it more and to recognize ourselves. And in that way, once we recognize it, we can, limit the time we spend on social media, which will limit increasing feelings of depression or anxiety. So in conclusion, the increase of smartphone usage has brought an increase in the use of social media. And with this, there has also been an all-time high increase of mental health issues in relation to the use of social media. Addressing this correlation can only help better to improve the way social media is used and to improve the way we see ourselves on a social platform. Recognizing the mental health problems associated with social media will do nothing but try and fix a problem before it becomes too late, and the negative effects associated with social media start to take a toll on the psyche of young teens and adults, which can and a lot of the times have led to be detrimental. And this is what we really want to avoid. So thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Josie. That was awesome. We're going to go right into our Q&A, our live Q&A. So does anyone right off the bat have any questions for Josie? You can either unmute or put them in the chat. Yeah, go ahead now.
Hi, Josie. Great presentation.
Hi. Yes.
I wanted to ask why you mentioned that social media leads to isolation, and this might seems counterintuitive, but could you explain why this is?
Yes. So I think what I meant to say, like point out by isolation, is it more isolates us from face-to-face interactions. I think a lot of people who spend their time on social media are, they're socializing, but not in a face-to-face like interaction, which, is not good. We need to have like in-person conversations to really excel and to basically just grow as humans. Sorry, I'm really nervous.
I have a question.
Yes.
So you talked a lot about, Snapchat and Facebook and Instagram, because I'm sure that's where most of the research is.
Right.
Do you have any opinions on like recent social media platforms like Vine or TikTok? Do you think like where do they fall? Do you think they're worse or if they're better?
So, like as I was saying, like the research is so new. Like literally my research, the research that I've included in this came out like 2 months ago. So everything is like constantly like changing. There's not a lot of like research done on TikTok, but I'm sure in the next like 6 months, we'll start to see a lot coming out of the woodwork as people are continuing to like take down those statistics. And every time a child or a young adult like goes to talk to someone about mental health concerns, social media does come into that conversation. So the more people are reporting those encounters, the more we'll have to like the tangible evidence we'll have in correlation. But I do think like Vine started 2 years after Instagram. It didn't have as a presence as I would say TikTok does today. But I think we can see as time goes on, we'll definitely see more mental health concerns with TikTok as well as Instagram. I think just because Instagram has been around for so long and it's such a dominant platform, everyone uses that platform among other platforms. Like personally for me, I only use Instagram. I don't have a TikTok because I do see TikToks on Instagram. So I can't say that I feel those mental health issues from TikTok, but I'm sure, other people do.
Absolutely.
If that
Thank
helps
you.
answer your
Yes.
question.
We have a question in chat from Glenna. They say, I've heard the gamification of social media to make it addictive. What responsibility do you think the company should take to combat the negative effects of the platforms? I know they have dopamine labs. Do you to make these platforms addictive? Could you comment on that?
Yes, I do think these platforms are very addictive because of the algorithms, which is a whole nother kind of like research project. So, the more time you spend on your phone, the more time it gets to know you. So all of your social media, and even your phone itself will show you like news that you would want to see. And on social media, it's going to show you just stuff, posts, basically anything that you're interested in. It's going to show you what you want. So it's going to increase your time on the app, which is going to lead to addictive behaviors. And then also, I know the platforms are not really doing as much as they can, because I did hear that Instagram is announcing a platform for ages, I think it's 8 to 12, which is just insane. Now you have like 8-year-olds having their own social media platform, which is just crazy.
I have one more question, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Perfect. So I know you were saying that some of the problems with social media is isolation and the fear of missing out.
Right.
Do you think that these problems would have been magnified through the COVID-19 pandemic while everyone was locked at home without social media?
Definitely. I think that the pandemic definitely made this problem, I think, even worse, because people didn't have the time to get out of their house and for example, like go to school or go to work. So they're just sitting in their house all day on social media. And during the pandemic, you start to see people who are a little more better off than others and how they got to spend their quarantine versus how some of us who have lesser got to spend our quarantine. And I think those associations really impacted people negatively. So definitely.
Thanks.
Thank you, Josie. Do we have any more last minute questions? All right, awesome job, Josie. That was fantastic.
Thank you. I was so nervous.
You did a great job. We are going to move on to our next presentation.
The next speaker is Alexandra Aloni, and she will be presenting Christianity in Modern Art, a cultural and social examination. This project analyzes the changes in art containing Christian religious subjects with a focus on the 18th century to modern day society.
All right, give me 1 second to share my screen for Alexi's presentation. All right, and here we go.
Hello everyone, my name is Alexi Aloni, and my research covers Christianity in modern art, a cultural and social
Christine, the volume's a little low. I'm not sure if there's a different way to share your sound, maybe.
I think you just have to turn it up from the video itself. Oh, it's up. Never mind.
Sorry, from like here?
Yeah, but it looks like it's already up.
Is there any way I can do that on does this do anything?
Maybe if we all just turn our volumes up all the way, if everyone else can hear, then we'll go with it.
Sorry guys, on my iMovie it literally sounded like I was like screaming, so I'm very shocked that it's too quiet. Like it was way too loud on my iMovie. But
that's all right.
Okay.
Good luck, everyone.
history classes have
Okay, so I'm just gonna keep going and hopefully y'all can hear it.
taught us man-made art has been a popular form of expression since the Stone Age. These illustrations and other artistic creations have been used to conceptualize cultures and societies long before official historical documentation began. And even though there are now primary and secondary texts that can be used to get a similar understanding of our world, I believe art pieces allow for greater individualized connections and conclusions to be drawn. And as we know, one major influential aspect of society is religion, more specifically, the religion of Christianity. With Christianity comes artistic religious depictions of biblical stories and Christian figures, which have changed drastically over the last few centuries as a consequence of altered rules within contemporary society. To explore this, I will be looking through the lens of artistic interpretation with earlier artists like Jean-Baptiste Simon Chardin to the more modern Chrysophilie, so the evolution of Christianity in society can be better understood by examining the change surrounding culture reflected in Christian art. Now, before I continue, I should make it clear that my research question considers any piece that includes Christian traditions, biblical figures, and stories, no matter how controversial they may be, as Christian art. Now, to properly investigate the topic, my presentation will cover the biographies of considered artists, the context in which the production of each work took place, and finally, the specific content of the works in question with the method of compare and contrast weaved in throughout to analyze the changes in Christian art. By the 1700s, Isaac Newton and John Locke's ideas regarding enlightenment had made its way to France during the rule of Louis XV, who followed after the death of Louis XIV. In the era of enlightenment, critical thinkers valued observations to develop their minds and influence others to do the same. Locke was even known to maintain that the only source of our knowledge was our senses, and that there was no innate knowledge that a human possessed. Like Locke, Voltaire had the same ideologies and helped introduce Newton and Locke's Enlightenment to the French community, and the artist, Voltaire, was a contributor to Enlightenment ideas in France that rejected submitting to religious authority. Despite this, religion remained prevalent in society, and certain practices of Christianity were viewed by some as appealing and simplistic, as it separated people from the aristocratic city of Paris. Chardin is one example of an artist who enjoyed the practices of simple families. Born in Paris to a cabinet maker, he eventually became an apprentice to two different artists, then went on to become a master himself. Only 2 years after his daughter and son were baptized in 1733, his wife, Marguerite, died. After nearly 2 years had passed, his daughter, Marguerite Agnes, met the same fate as her mother. By 1737, Chardin regularly exhibited at the Salon and continued to favor still life work that showed common activities. So, in Chardin's Saying Grace, 1740, he paints a mother and her 2 daughters around the dinner table in a seemingly small room. The table is not extravagant by any means, and is a symbol itself for simplicity. The clothes of the subjects and the decor of the room are similarly subtle in nature and perfectly match the natural art of Chardin. In the center of the painting, you can see the mother helping her child carrying out grace before their meal. And although this painting does not contain images of actual Christian figures, the act of thanking God prior to eating through grace is associated with Christian traditions. Through Chardin's perspective, we understand the appeal of simplistic Christian rituals that remained in domestic life. When I consider the loss he experienced, I see how it may have influenced his choice to produce this particular work of art. Significantly, the fact that Chardin's Saying Grace was even created and is studied today as it has gained popularity, that shows the Christian traditions were as accepted and as prevalent at the time of productions as they are today. Regardless of Newton and Locke's emphasis on enlightenment, Chardin's value had a place in society and were associated with the humble way of life distant from that of Rococo ideals. Next, we have post-impressionist artist Paul Gauguin, who served as a stockbroker in Paris, France for some years. It wasn't until the stock market crashed that he was jobless and in search of a new life purpose. Since he had been an amateur artist for some time, only 1 year later he made the decision to try his luck at working under commissions. Eventually, he became dissatisfied with the fixed culture and modernization of Paris, so he packed up and moved to Pont-Aven after familiarizing himself with the work of an artist named Emily Bernard. While living there, Gauguin created the piece Vision After the Sermon, or Jacob Wrestling with the Angel, in 1888, which featured the Breton women of Pont-Aven having a religious experience following a church service. Notably, Gauguin found symbolism valid only when it was an actual attribute to people's beliefs and practices, not something artificially applied to the depiction of religious subjects. This belief in particular had an influence on his art, as seen in Vision After the Sermon, and its creation alludes to the religious influence that remained in society during the 1800s. Then, in the following year, Gauguin created a painting of a similar nature which was named Yellow Christ in 1889. This painting contains the crucifixion of Jesus done in a vivid yellow which matches the hills of the autumn harvest background. Notably, Gauguin based his depiction of the crucifixion off one within the church of Tremello, which neared Pont-Aven. In the forefront, on the left-hand side, you can see traditionally dressed peasants with expressionless faces during a Catholic prayer ritual. Gauguin is known to have used the color yellow as a way to communicate his feelings toward the isolated lives of the portrayed peasants whose primitivity were of great appeal to him. Overall, Gauguin's Yellow Christ is done in a way that uses a visual symbol of a naive and trusting religious faith to commend the simplistic natural lives of the surrounding peasants and to also bring awareness of their blind faith. Before I continue, I want to point out how fascinating it is to see how religious practice is connected to a natural way of living in both Chardin's Saying Grace and Gauguin's Yellow Christ, despite their differing periods of creation, with Gauguin's during a more modern Paris. Exactly 100 years after Yellow Christ, photographer and artist André Serrano created a piece that was far more controversial than that of Gauguin's. So, to start, Serrano grew up in a Roman Catholic home where he often saw religious images, especially those of Jesus Christ. His background paired with an interest in bodily fluids resulted in the creation of his 1989 piece, Piss Christ. Piss Christ is a red, orange, and yellow-colored photograph of a crucified Jesus submerged in actual urine. In an interview, Serrano explained that we treat it, the crucifix, almost like a fashion accessory, and for Christ to have been crucified and laid on the cross for 3 days, where he not only bled to death, he shot himself and he beat himself to death. Here, Serrano is trying to show audiences that although Piss Christ may seem offensive, it is quite frankly a good representation of what had actually been endured during the crucifixion and the reality of what surrounds a religious event that is often mindlessly commemorated by over 1 billion in the world. Despite Serrano's intentions, in 1889 there were many who disagreed with his point of view. They protested a grant given to him by the National Endowment for the Arts Funds. The work of Serrano seemed too ill mannered to understand for some, and this led a group of Catholic fundamentalists to use hammers to attack and destroy the photograph. On one hand, Sereno's use of urine and piss Christ seems to intentionally assault Christian and Catholic communities. But on the other hand, Piss Christ, 1989, is an artistic expression of Sereno's perspective on the contemporary use of a religious symbol he grew up seeing and surrounded with. Now, I think it would be interesting to quickly look at a side-by-side comparison of Yellow Christ and Piss Christ. Visually, both include the crucifix as the main subject and use the color yellow to investigate the body and its materiality. Even the titles are extremely similar, so it's safe to assume that Sereno drew some inspiration from Gauguin's work made exactly 100 years before his own. Okay, so Andres Sereno is not alone when it comes to producing and using artistic interpretations of religious symbols and figures. There have been many modern amateur and professional artists who use religion as the subjects for their works, and a great example of this is none other than Chris O'Feely. So, O'Feely was born in Manchester in 1968, then went on to attend the Chelsea School of Art in London. Eventually, he became a part of the Young British Artists and received a Turner Prize. He is known for creating art that analyzes the contemporary Black experience through various cultural and historical origins, including Christianity. Symbolic of his Nigerian roots, he makes use of elephant dung to support and display many of his works, and will even include it within the actual art. Again, O'Feely is an artist who became recognized for his application of elephant dung, which is somewhat comparable to Sereno's use of bodily fluids, but this is not the only way these two artists are alike. O'Feely has also received immense backlash for the work he created containing a Christian figure, the Virgin Mary. In Chris O'Feely's The Holy Virgin Mary, 1996, viewers can see various materials such as acrylic, oil, polyester resin, paper collage, glitter, matte pins, and elephant dung that make up the canvas. Centered on the canvas is his version of the Virgin Mary, who has dark skin, eyes open wide, and parted lips that take up a third of her face, hinting at racial stereotypes. Mary is wearing a blue dressing that matches countless other depictions of her and the importance of blue noted in the Old Testament. From my understanding, the Old Testament uses the color blue as a representation of heaven, so it makes sense that the Queen of Heaven herself would be shown wearing or around blue. A closer look reveals a gold-colored background that is made up of dots in a style somewhat similar to pointillism, with a butterfly-like collage of women's buttocks taken from pornographic magazines. Next, the dried balls of elephant dung are placed where Mary's breast should be, as well as at the bottom portion of the canvas to keep it held up on display. Lastly, scribed on the elephant dung are two matte pins which read Virgin on the left and Mary on the right, the title of the work. As mentioned earlier, O'Feely received backlash similar to Sereno, and in 1999, the mayor of New York led an opposition to the Sensation exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum and singled out as blasphemous the Holy Virgin Mary. This protest was not taken lightly by members of society, and in the same year, a 72-year-old man by the name of Dennis Heiner vandalized the Holy Virgin Mary, which is captured on the right, as he stepped behind the plexiglass guard and smeared paint from a tube all over the canvas. I'd like to point out that this man is using white paint and is literally whitewashing the Virgin Mary shown in O'Feely's work. Despite the extreme backlash received, O'Feely has explained that aspects of his work were done with purpose. For example, the elephant dung put in place of her breasts allude to the absence of a baby, and the untraditional position of the painting's display, which is leaning up against the wall, is done so that the viewers are one with the Holy Virgin Mary, rather than simply observers of it. The dimensions of O'Feely's work are somewhat large, so leaning it this way brings the intimacy back in. When comparing Saying Grace from 1740 and the Holy Virgin Mary from 1996, it is evident that the two works contrast in significant ways. The progression is clear when comparing one work after another, however, new insight is provided when pieces are viewed alone. Modern art talks about the importance of the individual, and each artist reflects their individual feelings towards Christianity. Okay, so the differences in visual imagery is very apparent, so I would like to focus on the context of the Christian art pieces as a reflection of the change in culture and society. First, Chardin's work is used to bring awareness to the appeal of simplistic Christian rituals in domestic life, with one possible interpretation being that Chardin looked to Christian faith as a sort of comfort with a deep personal meaning, while O'Feely uses a Christian figure to draw audiences in order to convey complex modern issues. In response to critics who claim his work is much too erotic, O'Feely has said, "When I go to the National Gallery and see paintings of the Virgin Mary, I see how sexually charged they are. Mine is simply a hip-hop version." The simple act of portraying the Virgin Mary with dark skin is controversial in itself, but it's yet another historical inaccuracy that has been overlooked in countless Christian images. Essentially, Ophelia is urging society to reject blind faith and question their understanding of religion and culture, as we often fail to do so. That is not to say that everyone must become atheists. Instead, we should focus on questioning our beliefs in all areas of life, rather than accepting them to be the ultimate truth. In conclusion, artistic expression, controversial or not, demonstrates the true power of art time and time again. Less than 2 months ago, musical artist Lil Nas X released the music video for his song Montero, or Call Me By Your Name, in which he rides a pole down to hell and gives Satan, who has his face, a lap dance. It is common knowledge that homosexuals are told by highly religious people they are going to hell, and as a gay man, Lil Nas X is making the statement that he is not living in fear of these beliefs, but is embracing his contenders. In an extreme way, yes, but with nearly 200 million views, it is clearly powerful nonetheless. The question now is, what will the future hold for Christian art? In any case, contemporary art containing Christian subjects will surely spark conversations that will influence and reflect the progression of culture and society. Here are my references that I used for my project, and I would just like to thank everyone for listening to my research presentation on Christianity and modern art, a cultural and social examination. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Alexi. That was awesome. I'd like to just start the discussion. Does anyone have any questions for Alexi? You can unmute or drop them in chat. Okay. Oh, go ahead, Josie.
I have a question. In your research, did you find like a correlation between like the artist and their like financial like state? Like, did you see that those correlations were more prominent in those who are not as wealthy as others?
I didn't really look into like the actual financial state of any of the artists. I think the only one where I discussed that was with Gauguin because he
Right.
left his work like because the stock market shut down, but that was in the 1880s.
Right. I was just like listening to your presentation, like each artist seemed to have like struggles that kind of influence their art. So I think
Yeah.
it's a correlation maybe between those two things.
Yeah, I think that'd be cool to look into a bit further, but I didn't do that in the past.
Okay.
All right. I have a question. Oh, what got you into this kind of part of research? Like it's such like a niche part. I mean, I know that art history has like a lot of Christian works, but what got you into like comparing these specific art pieces?
Okay, this was like definitely the hardest part of my project, like finding what artworks I wanted to look at, but like I was honestly influenced by watching like Lil Nas X's music video. Like that's what like gave me the idea because I thought it was just like so crazy the backlash he was just like receiving on TikTok, but he just like took it and he ran with it, and like all publicity is good publicity. So yeah, I worked with Professor Clough, and we went through like 200 years of history to find which art pieces I should use. And yeah, I had no like prior knowledge of Piss Christ or Yellow Christ or the Holy Virgin Mary. So it was very interesting for me to look into it and learn about it myself.
I really like how you wrapped it up with Little Nas X because it makes the whole thing very relevant in today's society.
It's like, where is it going?
Yeah, like where is it taking us?
Mm-hmm.
And I think like now, especially with like Little Nas X, like it's like people are starting to claim it more than, you know, being kind of ashamed of it.
The power of art.
Right.
Yeah.
Through music as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I think it was cool to add in the music video because it's like, what do you define as art? Like this week we were looking at street art and we were like really thinking about like what makes an art piece considered an art piece. Like is just spray painting an eye patch over the Mona Lisa really art? Well, yeah, I can sell for $10,000. So it's like it's pretty crazy to consider.
I think it's always like the reason behind that
Yes,
act of the art.
for sure. Definitely like, and also the hype that gets built around it that can make you thousands, millions.
You did a really good job.
Thank you.
Do we have any more questions for Alexi? Go ahead.
In Yellow Christ, do the figures surrounding Jesus Christ resemble certain individuals, or is it just kind of general additions?
So this was a group of what did he call them? Primitists, like talking about the primitivity of them, and how they were living in like this primal sort of environment. I don't think they're reflective of like specific women who were there, but just like the general group. But yeah, it was just like very cool civilization. I didn't look into it too much just because it would make my research like 20 minutes, 30 minutes and it would go over. But yeah, I definitely like recommend if you guys would like to look into Yellow Christ further and the life that he lived there while he was on or in Pontevan.
All right, do we have any more questions? Okay, thank you so much, Alexi. That was an awesome presentation.
Thanks, guys.
We will be moving on to our next presenter.
Okay, our next speaker is Jasmine Mata, and she will present the impact of crisis management, a PowerPoint presentation highlighting the importance of crisis management and the impact it can have on companies.
Hello, guys. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Are you guys able to see it? Or am I muted?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay. So hello, my name is Jasmine Mata, and my presentation is going to be on crisis management. So crisis management is critical to all companies. If a company does a poor job when it comes to crisis management, then it will result in negative outcomes for the company. So what is a crisis? A crisis is either a public threat, a financial loss, or a reputation loss. And there are two types of crisis management. Of crisis. There's an external crisis and an internal crisis. So in this picture, you can see the two different types of crisis, the external and internal. So an external crisis is when the crisis happens outside of the company, such as a natural disaster or customer complaints, customer issues. And an internal crisis is when the crisis comes from inside of the company, such as a product defect, problems with management, or employee complaints. So how does a crisis affect the company? So I have an example here. So like, let's say the company Converse comes out with a product that can be offensive to some cultures. If Converse is unable to successfully address that crisis, their public image can be tainted. And since this would be an external crisis because the problem is coming from complaints of customers, they can have a loss in the trust of the customers, which can lead to a loss in sales, which will lead to a financial loss, which is why it's important to always address the problem in a positive way. That way you can regain customer trust so you won't have a financial loss. So there are 3 stages to a crisis. The first one is the pre-crisis stage. And in this stage, a company will assess all of the risk factors of the possibility of a crisis and try to reduce them in order to prevent a crisis from happening in the first place. But obviously, crisis can be inevitable because there are external and internal factors. So for external factors, a company will try to prepare with a crisis management team in order to be ready for a crisis before it even happens. And stage 2 of a crisis is a crisis response. Now, this happens as soon as the crisis hits the company, and this is when a PR team will draft a response for statements to put out either on their social media outlets or have their spokesperson read. And the purpose of a response statement is to address the public and to ensure them that the company meant no harm and that they had good intentions. And the three main components of a response statement is to be quick, be accurate, and be consistent. You want to be quick because you want to be the first person to address the situation. This is because a lot of media outlets can twist the truth or put out fake facts, and that's something that you want to avoid. And you want to be accurate and be consistent because you don't want there to be a situation where they go back and you kind of twisted the truth to make yourself look better, or you kind of hid something to make the company look better, and then that comes to light. Because not only did you already lose some of your customers, some trust of your customers when the crisis hit, but now you're going to lose even more because you weren't being truthful in your response statement. And another part of crisis response is to repair the reputation of your company. And this is where you will promise change or promise certain things to your customers in order to regain their trust. And part 3 is post-crisis. Now, this is when the company has somewhat moved past the issue, but the issue still requires some attention. And this is when the company will start completing the certain promises and the certain changes that it promised back in the crisis stage in hopes to build the company back up. So this is one example of positive crisis management in an external example. So in 1982, there was contaminated Tylenol that killed 8 people. And due to this, Johnson & Johnson had to recall $100 million worth of product off of the shelves. And in order to help regain some trust from their customers, they decided to redesign the entire packaging of the bottle, even though it was going to cost them over $500 million to change all the packaging and to add a safety feature, which was going to be that security cap. That way nobody can contaminate or put in something that's not supposed to be in there. And this was effective crisis management of an external crisis because even though the company lost some trust of their customers, they regained a lot of it back because they put the safety of their customer first and not the financial aspect of it. They were willing to spend the money to ensure that their customers felt safe taking the product rather than leaving the product as it was. And in the bottom picture, you can see the difference in the security caps. And even now today, we have like the child lock and we have the security seal that we have to peel off. And now I want to talk about a negative crisis management, which is Volkswagen. And this crisis happened internally because in September of 2015, they were in the violation of the Clean Air Act. And this is because Volkswagen had implanted little devices in their vehicles that would rig cars during smog testing, and it would only control emissions while the cars were being tested. And this issue was a very big issue because not only did they willingly and knowingly do this to their cars, but when they were asked to release a statement and, address the problem, they were very inconsistent with their statements and with the reasonings as to why it happened. So they lost a lot of trust, not only with their customers, but with their stockholders as well. And in the bottom graph here, you can see the first drop was when the incident first happened. And then the second drop is when, they just found out that they were being really inconsistent and they didn't want to take responsibility for what they have done. And it really didn't rub the investors the right way because they felt like they were being lied to and they felt like they weren't handling the situation appropriately. And this resulted in a loss of sales and a lot of loss in their stockholder support. And you can tell by the graph, it still hasn't really built back up to where it was. And that's why it's really important to be consistent and accurate when it comes to your response statements and when it comes to owning up to the incidents that happened. In conclusion, the importance of crisis management is unmeasurable when it comes to companies. And even though companies will try to reduce the chances of a crisis happening, it's inevitable, which is why it's really important for companies to practice crisis management and have certain strategies in place for different scenarios that can happen. And with this, a company will come out stronger in the end. And if they handle it well, they could gain the respect of new prospective customers. And that is my presentation.
Thank you so much, Jasmine. That was awesome. We'll go right into our Q&A. If anyone has any questions right off the bat. Again, you can drop them in chat or unmute yourself. I'll start off with the question I have. Your examples for the Tylenol and Volkswagen, I'm so glad you included examples because that was super helpful in understanding what good and bad crisis management is. I was wondering, I can tell you did a lot of research. What was something that was like the hardest to research or like your biggest challenge in that?
I think my biggest challenge was kind of finding the response statements for Volkswagen and kind of how like the numbers were really like tainted just because there's a lot of different numbers and the quarterly sheets were a little bit hard to read.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Does anyone have a question for Jasmine?
Hey, Jasmine.
Go ahead.
What's a crisis that's fatal or that's like very hard to recover from?
I think a crisis that's very hard to recover from is definitely when there's like a breach in privacy with your customers, because then it's very hard for them to want to like, give you their card information or just like sign up for loyalty programs because they feel like you're going to release their information. So that's probably one of the worst ones to go. Or if especially today, if you aren't sensitive to some cultures and, use offensive language or culture appropriation, it's very difficult to come back from that, especially in today.
Niall, I think you had a question.
Yes, and just echoing Hamilton's question, are there any major examples where large companies have completely collapsed after a crisis?
Well, right now, some companies that I know of are Tresemme because they have had a lot of chemicals in like their hair products that causes like some people's hair has fallen out or some people like have had like really bad allergic reactions. So me personally, I stopped using Tresemme and I know a lot of people have stopped using Tresemme. So yeah.
Yes, Jessie.
For like Niall's question, I know there's also a lot of companies specifically for like women's birth control that have ended completely because of their products.
Yeah, kind of adding on to that whole everyone's kind of commenting questions on that. Do you think that this whole like cancel culture thing kind of does take a big effect on how companies handle their crisis management?
I do think that canceling companies is very big these days. And I feel like that's why companies are so quick these days to release statements as accurately as they can, just because people these days will really analyze everything you've done in the past. And I think that's why crisis management today is just really important.
Absolutely. Thank you.
I agree. You did really good.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions for Jasmine?
Okay, I have one that like kind of takes it like a different direction. I feel like in this day and age, people who are like branding themselves, such as like James Charles, they have had to come out with a few like apology videos. What do you think they could learn in terms of like crisis management from companies like Tylenol?
So what I've seen in those sorry videos that I think are very helpful in their cases is that they provide what they call receipts, which is usually like screenshots of text messages and stuff like that. For me personally, I feel like sometimes they're a little bit inaccurate and sometimes they even twist the truth to make themselves look like a better person. So I feel like sometimes it's better to just own up to what you did and like air it out, because then people will respect you more that way, because it's like, yeah, you messed up, but you're willing to take ownership rather than you messed up and then you're going to lie about it, because then people will just lose trust in you completely.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, kind of commenting on that, I've been seeing a lot in the like in media recently, like Chrissy Teigen, a lot of like her old like tweets have resurfaced, and I guess like she's being canceled as well. Do you think if like people address problems like that before it becomes like blown up, do you think that can help combat the backlash they face?
I think what a lot of people need to think about when digging up old stuff is what was culturally appropriate at the time.
Right.
Because I feel like a lot of people don't take that into consideration. It's like, what was everybody else doing?
Right.
And I
They
feel like
kind of
because
draw it back to today.
yeah, and it's like, you know, a lot of things that were okay in the past are obviously not okay today. But I feel like a lot of people did a lot of things that were not okay in the past, or that were not okay, but they were okay in the past. And I feel like that's what people don't take into consideration, is that what was everybody else doing
At
too?
the time.
Yeah.
Not that they were like necessarily okay, it's just that they weren't the main focal of.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
All right. Are there any last questions for Jasmine? All right, awesome job, Jasmine. You did a wonderful job.
Thank you.
We're gonna have one last presenter for the session.
Okay, our final speaker, Grace Lee, will present Why Do People Choose Internet Convenience over Online Privacy Concerns? An analysis of the relationship between internet users' cognition of privacy violations resulted from internet surveillance and internet management.
Give me 1 second to share my screen again. Okay. And here's our presentation.
Hi everyone, my name is Grace Lee, and my presentation is going to be focusing on online privacy and internet surveillance. People's desire for more privacy in the online world is increasing every day. Due to the ongoing issues that may reveal their actual identity or personal information, I decided that the following topic is a vital topic to tackle. Informing people about the danger of online privacy and suggesting possible ways to ameliorate this ongoing issue is what I'm aiming for. Before we start, I would like to explain briefly about what exactly surveillance is. Surveillance is a systematic, continuous monitoring. In other words, the role of surveillance is to know what is going on. The subject under surveillance are people, objects, their actions, situations or changes that concern them. The main objective of surveillance is to know what is going on, what led to the situation, and what risk is associated to it. Internet surveillance in particular is monitoring of online activity. It keeps track of one's activities, data, and behavior. There are numerous benefits related to internet surveillance. It is a critical part for our internet revolution. These surveillances are not only used for benefits, but has negative effects as well. Internet is like a panopticon, where the interior of the building can be seen from a central point. Although it is said that we are the customers of the companies such as Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, the real truth behind this is that we are the products of the companies. Through the free browsing of their websites, they analyze and carefully observe how we surf the net and collect data from it. Internet surveillance can benefit different companies and have several benefits. However, it is critical for us to be aware of the system and be responsible for our own personal information. First, it is important to examine whether people are aware of internet surveillance and the risks behind it. It is shown that the internet users fall into three distinct groups, which are not concerned, highly concerned, and pragmatic. About 1/4 are not concerned about privacy, 1/4 are highly concerned, and half are pragmatic. The result clearly gives an idea of why violation of privacy through the internet is common and becoming increasingly easy. More than half of the internet users are not aware of the severity of this ongoing issue. Another question we should be asking is, if these people were aware of the privacy issues, would this stop them from releasing their personal information to the online world? To analyze the situation better, a research was conducted to investigate the relationship between knowledge about privacy matters and individuals' concern regarding the information exposure and websites or organizations that require personal information to the users. Another variable that was examined in the study was the rewards. As personal data are often gathered through rewards, such as access to the following content or presence, the research examines whether or not there is an effect on individuals in relation to their concern and knowledge. The study found out that with high level of reward seeking, the concerns tend to be strongly associated with privacy protection for people with higher levels of knowledge than lower levels of knowledge and concern. Thus, knowledge has an effect on the behavioral gap for people with high levels of concern, and the gap is also highly affected by high reward seeking. Privacy violation is a major issue, and it is more serious than what most people think. The internet users should know what these companies do with the gathered data and who is looking at it in what depth. However, it is problematic that the users do not know how far their information is getting shared and to what extent. For instance, let's talk about Facebook. By placing third-party cookies and Facebook logins on other sites, and by acquiring user data directly from third parties, Facebook continuously found different ways to collect users' personal information. This information leakage is apparent as Facebook admitted that it allows third-party apps to collect intimate data on its users. The information does not stay within the platform and therefore will be spread around without the user knowing about it. However, these internet surveillance technologies depend on situations. Clearly, in disastrous situations or life-threatening situations, almost everyone would agree in getting monitored. However, would people want to be monitored in normal life? To alleviate the issue, when setting up a surveillance system, people need to consciously agree both in providing their personal data and in being tracked by social network services. There should be rules made for respecting and preserving the user's privacy. There have been different approaches to fix the ongoing issue of internet surveillance. There are laws that were made for online privacy and security. Cybersecurity Act of 2015 is one of them. The law permits the network operators to monitor, operate defensive measures, and share information with others under given circumstances. When a law is set, the risk of users' information being used in the wrong way will significantly decrease. Thus, setting strict and specific rules regarding online privacy and surveillance can benefit both the organizations or companies and the internet users.
Another approach that has been made was the launching of Netra. The following system is able to detect any dubious voice traffic passing through software such as Skype or Google Talk, which makes tracking easier. Although these measures helped numerous users and protected them from surveillance technologies, the privacy issues are not going to be fixed unless people become more conscious about the risk and the organizations or companies to be responsible. Again, as the users become more aware of these privacy concerns, the social web providers should also be contributing to this. They should be offering mechanisms to raise their users' awareness of the fact that their disclosed information is open to public. The users must know how far their information will be shared and to whom. Providers such as companies and organizations should make their data analysis more transparent. As people view many websites distrustful and doubtful, they should be working on bringing up their reputation and restoring their credibility first. A way these organizations can make this more transparent is by showing the users how their information is used in these platforms and in what ways it will help them. Therefore, the users have to acknowledge the concerns related to internet surveillance, and at the same time, companies and organizations should come up with new methods to help these users more aware of what the information is used for and fulfill their responsibility. They could also tackle the problems related to online security by law to make it more credible. In conclusion, internet users should be more aware of negative effects related to internet surveillance. They should be more concerned and know how to protect their private information from getting released. One of the biggest reasons why people put in their private information or are allowed to give their location or other details is because they do not know how they can get exposed and that their information will be shared among various people and platforms to be analyzed further. Additionally, the providers, which are companies or organizations, should be more transparent towards the surveillance. They should be showing their customers how the information is shared and for what reasons. It is hard to find the right balance between using the internet and giving out information about us. However, it is an inevitable fact that the internet is becoming more common and a necessary tool for people. Therefore, both providers and the users should be careful and clear about the risk of internet surveillance. Thank you for listening to my presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Grace. That was awesome. Do we have any questions from the audience that you'd like to start out with? Either drop them in chat or unmute yourselves.
I have one question. First, it was excellent presentation. And I just wanted to ask, have there been any surveys which gauge to what extent users understand how they are being tracked?
I had a research about that talks about the association between tracking their social media and people's opinion on it, but I haven't found a research on to what extent they have been tracked or like how deep they have been tracked. I haven't found those researches yet.
Hey Grace, do you see any positive or benefit to like this invasion of privacy?
I honestly think surveillance is a helpful method for different companies and organizations because through this method, they can be tracking and analyzing how the users surf through the internet. So I definitely think it's going to be helpful for the companies. But if, by thinking in the customers and the internet users perspective, I think there might be more risk related to it if they aren't careful enough and aware of the concerns and the cause and effects of providing their personal information to these organizations and companies.
Grace, do you think that it also benefits maybe tracking like biased news or just things that could ultimately like harm others? Do you think it's like it benefits it in that way though?
Yeah, I definitely think it
It's
will.
kind of like a sensor.
Mhm. Yeah, it is helpful for those methods, but my research was more of like focusing on how the internet users were providing different information, their private informations, and these companies and organizations. I just wanted to make sure that they were being more cautious about it, and how the customers, they should be more aware of the fact that their private information is getting released to different parts of the world, and they are not aware of how deep how in depth their information is getting released and to whom it's getting released. So I just wanted to emphasize the importance of being aware of the cause and effect and the risk related towards the internet surveillance methods.
Yeah, you did a really good job. I really liked your presentation.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Grace before we wrap up? Okay, well, thank you so much. Thank you, Grace, for your presentation. It was very well done, and to the rest of you as well. Josie, Alexi, and Jasmine, great job. Really learned a lot today and had a great time. Great questions also by our audience. So thank you guys so much. I think Christine lost internet connection, so she didn't mean to bail on us so early, but that concludes our OMNI Spring 2021 conference. So thank you, Grace, for wrapping us up on a high note. And I hope you all have a wonderful day today. For any of you who are graduating, congratulations. We're so proud of you that you made it through this year. And for those who are not graduating quite yet, we are excited to see you in the fall and hopefully see more presentations. Alexi, yes, go ahead and ask your question.